You know, when I signed up for the Galactic Medical Exchange program, I thought the biggest challenge would be learning to pronounce my classmates' names without accidentally insulting their mothers. Turns out that was the least of my problems. The Zephyrian Medical Academy is what happens when you take every medical drama you've ever seen, crank the pretentiousness up to 11, and then add tentacles. Picture the most sterile, chrome-covered facility you can imagine, floating in space like a giant metallic donut, and you're halfway there. The other half involves holographic displays that would make Tony Stark jealous and medical equipment that probably costs more than Earth's entire GDP. I'm Dr. Jake Morrison, by the way. Yes, that's right, just Dr. Jake Morrison from good old Earth, where we still use things like bandages and aspirin. Here at the Academy I'm what you might call the village idiot. Except the village is populated by beings who can perform cellular reconstruction with their minds, and consider a heart transplant to be elementary school level work. My professor is Klexon, a 7-foot-tall insectoid, who looks like a praying mantis had a baby with a NASA computer. He has compound eyes that can apparently see into 17 different dimensions, which he uses primarily to look down on me with mathematical precision. Klexon speaks in a voice that sounds like someone gargling with liquid nitrogen, and he begins every sentence with, "as any competent medical practitioner would know," which is his polite way of saying I'm an idiot. Then there are my classmates. There's Vortex, who's basically a sentient cloud of gas that somehow managed to get into medical school. How does a gas cloud hold a scalpel, you ask? Very carefully, and with a lot of complaints about atmospheric pressure. Krista is our resident crystalline being who looks like someone bedazzled a chandelier and gave it a medical degree. She communicates through harmonic frequencies that sound like a choir of angels having an argument. The star pupils, though, are the ones who really make me question my life choices. They can diagnose 17 rare diseases just by looking at a patient's aura, perform surgery using only their telekinetic powers, and apparently learned advanced neurosurgery before they learned to walk, or float, or whatever it is they do for locomotion. So there I was, sitting in advanced quantum biology class, trying to figure out why anyone would need to understand the philosophical implications of a spleen, when the alarms started blaring. Not the gentle chiming you might expect from such a refined institution, but full-blown red alert, everyone panic right now sirens. Professor Klexon's antenna twitched, which I'd learned meant either deep concern or severe indigestion. "Students," he announced, his voice cutting through the chaos like a rusty knife through butter. "We have a medical emergency. A transport shuttle has crashed in the docking bay. Multiple casualties. This will serve as your final practical examination." And that's when I realized that all those hours of studying 17-dimensional anatomy charts weren't going to help me nearly as much as the summer I spent working at County General back home, where Saturday nights were basically a master class in creative ways humans could injure themselves. You want to know the difference between theoretical knowledge and real-world application? Watch a bunch of honor students face their first actual emergency. It's like watching a computer try to process the concept of chaos. We rushed to the docking bay, which in Space Academy terms means we floated very quickly through corridors that probably cost more to build than most planets' annual budgets. The crash site looked like someone had taken a perfectly good shuttle and played volleyball with it using asteroids. Smoke was pouring out of the wreckage and I could hear groaning from inside. My classmates immediately went into what I can only describe as academic shock. Vortex started cycling through approximately 14 different shades of purple, which according to his species meant he was either deeply concerned or needed to find a bathroom. Krista began resonating at frequencies that sounded like a smoke detector having an existential crisis. "Alert, alert," she chimed. "Multiple trauma detected. Initiating full diagnostic protocols." Professor Klexon's compound eyes were practically spinning as he surveyed the scene. "Class, this is clearly a complex multi-system trauma scenario requiring our most advanced intervention. We must prepare the quantum surgical suite immediately." Now, while they were busy calculating the theoretical implications of the crash, I was looking at the actual victim. Captain Rexa, a 7-foot-tall reptilian who looked like an iguana that had been hitting the gym way too hard, was dragging herself out of the wreckage with a nasty gash running down her right arm. Green blood, which I assumed was normal for her species, was dripping steadily onto the deck. Behind her came Engineer Bloom, a plant-based life form who resembled a walking fern with opposable thumbs. Bloom had multiple cuts across what I assumed were his leaves, and some kind of sap was oozing from the wound. "Oh my," gasped Vortex, swirling anxiously. "The severity of these injuries requires immediate consultation with the Galactic Trauma Database. We should cross-reference their species-specific healing matrices with the current atmospheric conditions, and factor in the gravitational variance of this sector." Krista was practically vibrating with excitement. "Yes, and we must consider the quantum fluctuations in their cellular structure. This could take hours of preparation to ensure optimal healing resonance." Meanwhile, Captain Rexa was looking at her arm with the kind of expression that universal translates to "I'm bleeding and would like this to stop sometime before I die of old age." "Hey," I said, stepping forward. "Maybe we should just clean the wounds and stop the bleeding first." The silence that followed was so profound I could hear the space station's life support systems humming. Professor Klexon turned all 17 of his compound eyes toward me with the kind of look you'd give someone who just suggested performing brain surgery with a butter knife. "Doc Morrison," he said, his voice dripping with the kind of condescension usually reserved for explaining basic concepts to very small children. "These are complex alien physiologies. Surely you understand that primitive Earth techniques would be inadequate for such sophisticated biological system." I looked at Captain Rexa, who was still bleeding. I looked at Engineer Bloom, who was starting to wilt in a way that suggested dehydration. Then I looked at my classmates, who were now debating whether they should factor in the shuttle's previous flight path when calculating optimal healing algorithms. "Right," I said. "Sophisticated biological systems. Got it. I'll just stand here and watch while you figure out the meaning of life." You know what's funny about emergencies? They don't wait for you to finish your dissertation on the theoretical applications of advanced healing methodologies. Captain Rexa was still bleeding. Engineer Bloom was looking more wilted by the minute, and my classmates were now pulling up holographic displays that looked like someone had crossed a medical textbook with a particle physics experiment. "According to the Intergalactic Medical Protocol 47B, announced Vortex, his gaseous form shifting through what I could only assume were colors of deep concentration, we must first perform a complete biospectral analysis to determine the optimal quantum frequency for cellular regeneration." Krista chimed in, literally. "Yes, and we must calibrate the nanosurgical array to account for their species-specific molecular vibrations. This requires accessing 17 different databases, and cross-referencing with current solar radiation levels." Meanwhile, Professor Klexon was gesturing dramatically at a wall display that showed more data than NASA uses to plan Mars missions. "Students, observe the complexity of these trauma patterns. We shall require the Mark 7 regenerative chamber, the quantum tissue synthesizer, and possibly the molecular reconstruction matrix." I watched this circus for about 30 seconds before my Earth-trained brain kicked in with a radical idea. What if, and hear me out here, what if we just stopped the bleeding first and worried about the fancy space medicine later? So while they were debating which of their 47 different laser scalpels would provide the most precise incision angles, I walked over to the emergency medical kit mounted on the wall. You know, the basic one that every species in the galaxy apparently keeps around for situations exactly like this. But nobody ever thinks to use because it's not sophisticated enough. I grabbed some antiseptic, gauze and a suture kit, real simple stuff. The kind of equipment that's been saving lives since humans figured out that maybe we shouldn't let people bleed to death while we contemplate the philosophical implications of their injuries. "Morrison," Professor Klexon called out, his voice carrying the tone of someone who's just caught a student cheating on an exam. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" "Stopping the bleeding," I replied, kneeling down next to Captain Rexa, who looked at me with the kind of grateful expression that transcends species barriers. "But you haven't calculated the optimal healing matrices," gasped Vortex, swirling with what I assumed was academic horror. "Or performed a molecular analysis of her blood chemistry," added Krista, her crystalline structure practically vibrating with concern. I looked up at them while cleaning Captain Rex's wound with basic antiseptic. "You know what? You're absolutely right. I have no idea what her blood chemistry is, but I do know that green stuff coming out of her arm isn't supposed to be coming out of her arm, and if we don't stop it she's gonna have a lot bigger problems than suboptimal healing matrix." Captain Rexa actually laughed, which sounded like a crocodile gargling with gravel. "The human makes sense," she said in accented but perfectly clear standard. "My arm hurts, I'm bleeding, and I'd very much like both of those things to stop." I started cleaning the wound properly, the way I'd learned during my rotation in Earth's emergency rooms. Nothing fancy, just good old-fashioned antiseptic and careful examination of the injury. The cut was deep but clean, probably from a piece of the shuttle's hull. No major arteries hit, no bone damage visible. Basic laceration repair, the kind of thing I'd done hundreds of times back home. "This is highly irregular," Professor Klexon protested. All 17 eyes focused on my hands as I threaded a needle. "Primitive suturing techniques have been obsolete for over 3 centuries. "Maybe," I said, making my first stitch. "But obsolete doesn't mean ineffective. Sometimes the old ways work just fine." Vortex was practically having a gaseous breakdown. "But what about the cellular regeneration enhancement protocols, the bioharmonic healing frequencies, the quantum-level tissue reconstruction algorithms?" I paused in my stitching to look up at him. "Tell you what, while I'm fixing Captain Rex's arm with these primitive techniques, why don't you go ahead and fire up all that fancy equipment for Engineer Bloom? I'm sure he'd appreciate the full treatment." You want to know what happens when you give a bunch of panicked students access to the most advanced medical equipment in the galaxy? The same thing that happens when you give a toddler the keys to a Ferrari. It's going to be loud, expensive, and somebody's probably going to cry. My classmates took my suggestion and ran with it. Which in hindsight was like suggesting they solve a math problem by detonating a nuclear reactor. Within minutes, they had activated approximately half of the medical bay's equipment. And the place was starting to look like a disco had a baby with a science fiction movie. The quantum tissue synthesizer was humming at frequencies that made my teeth ache. The molecular reconstruction matrix was projecting holographic displays that looked like someone had turned DNA into abstract art. And the Mark VII regenerative chamber was cycling through what I could only assume were every possible healing protocol known to galactic medicine. Initiating biospectral analysis, announced the main computer in a voice that somehow managed to sound both incredibly sophisticated and deeply concerned. Warning, chimed another system. Conflicting regeneration parameters detected. Alert, added a third. Atmospheric pressure variance exceeding optimal healing thresholds. Vortex was swirling between 3 different control panels, his gaseous form getting increasingly agitated as error messages started popping up faster than ads on a free streaming service. The bioharmonic frequencies aren't synchronizing with the quantum healing matrices, he gasped. Which sounded like a problem but could have been the plot of a bad science fiction movie. Krista was resonating at pitches that were making the equipment vibrate sympathetically, which was creating a feedback loop that sounded like a choir of angels having a heated argument with a construction site. The molecular analysis is showing contradictory results, she chimed frantically. Engineer Bloom's cellular structure is reading as both photosynthetic and chemosynthetic simultaneously. Professor Klexon was frantically manipulating holographic displays with 4 of his 6 arms while his compound eyes darted between 17 different readouts. Students, we must recalibrate the entire system. The quantum fluctuations are interfering with the bioregenerative processes. Meanwhile, I was making steady progress on Captain Rex's arm. Simple running stitches, the kind they teach you in first-year medical school. Clean, efficient, effective. The bleeding had stopped, the wound edges were properly aligned, and she was already looking better. How's it going over there? I called out to my classmates who were now arguing over which of the 47 diagnostic protocols they should prioritize. The Galactic Medical Database is experiencing system overload, Vortex announced, his form cycling through colors that I was pretty sure weren't supposed to exist in normal space. We need to access the emergency protocols, but they require authorization from 3 different medical departments and a complete astrobiological assessment. That's when the equipment started actively rebelling. The quantum tissue synthesizer began making sounds like a dying whale. The molecular reconstruction matrix started projecting error messages in languages I was pretty sure had been extinct for millennia. And the Mark VII regenerative chamber gave up entirely and just started flashing red lights while playing what sounded like elevator music performed by robots having existential crises. Perhaps, suggested Krista, her harmonic frequencies now reaching pitches that were making nearby metal objects vibrate. We should consult the complete Galactic Medical Database entry on plant-based lifeform trauma management. It's only 50,000 pages. Engineer Bloom, who had been patiently waiting while this technological circus performed around him, finally spoke up in a voice that sounded like wind through trees, if trees could be deeply sarcastic. Excuse me, but I'm starting to feel a bit faint. Could someone perhaps just clean these cuts while you figure out the meaning of life? Professor Klexon turned all 17 eyes toward Bloom with an expression that suggested deep professional concern mixed with mild panic. But we must ensure optimal healing parameters are achieved through proper quantum-level intervention. Or, I said, finishing the last stitch on Captain Rex's arm, someone could grab some antiseptic and bandages from that emergency kit over there and fix him up in about 10 minutes. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of expensive medical equipment having what could generously be called a complete nervous breakdown. Sometimes the universe has a sense of humor. Sometimes it waits until you're surrounded by the most advanced medical technology in the galaxy, watching it have a spectacular meltdown before it delivers the punchline. This was one of those times. I walked over to Engineer Bloom, who was indeed looking rather wilted around the edges. His leaf-like appendages were drooping, and the sap from his cuts was starting to crystallize, which I assumed wasn't a good sign for plant-based lifeforms. Mind if I take a look? I asked, grabbing the basic medical kit again. Bloom rustled in what I interpreted as consent. At this point, human, I would welcome intervention from a particularly skilled gardener. So while my classmates continued their frantic attempts to reprogram equipment that was apparently smarter than all of us combined, I got to work. Basic wound cleaning, just like I'd learned during my rotation in rural medicine back on Earth. Clean water, antiseptic, and careful examination of each cut. Plant physiology isn't exactly covered in human medical school, but bleeding is bleeding, regardless of whether it's red blood or green sap. The cuts were shallow, more like scrapes really, and they just needed to be cleaned and protected while his natural healing processes kicked in. You know, I said, gently cleaning a particularly nasty scrape on what I assumed was Bloom's shoulder. Back on Earth, we have this thing called first aid. It's based on a revolutionary concept called fix the immediate problem first, worry about the complicated stuff later. Captain Rexa, who was flexing her newly stitched arm with obvious satisfaction, laughed her crocodilian laugh. Human medicine sounds remarkably practical. It has to be, I replied, applying a simple bandage to one of Bloom's cuts. We're not smart enough to overcomplicate things. That's when Professor Klexon finally tore himself away from the light show his equipment was putting on. He approached us with the kind of cautious steps you'd use when investigating something that might explode. His compound eyes focused on Captain Rex's arm, then on my work on Engineer Bloom. This is, he began, then stopped. Started again. The healing response appears to be. Another pause. Optimal. I looked up from bandaging Bloom's arm. You sound surprised. Well, yes, no, Professor Klexon's antennae twitched in what I'd learned was his species' equivalent of frustrated confusion. Your techniques are so primitive. So basic. There's no quantum enhancement, no molecular level intervention, no bioharmonic frequency optimization. Nope, I agreed cheerfully, just clean the wound, stop the bleeding, protect it while it heals. Same way humans have been fixing injuries for thousands of years. Vortex had finally stopped swirling frantically and was now hovering nearby in what I assumed were colors of deep contemplation. But how do you know it will work without proper diagnostic analysis? I gestured to Captain Rexa, who was now doing basic mobility tests with her repaired arm. Because it's already working. Krista's harmonic frequencies had dropped to something resembling confused curiosity. But surely you must calculate the optimal healing parameters for maximum efficiency. Here's the thing, I said, finishing up Bloom's bandages. Sometimes maximum efficiency isn't the point. Sometimes good enough right now is better than perfect 3 hours from now. Engineer Bloom rustled in what sounded like agreement. The human speaks wisdom. I feel considerably better, and it required no consultation with galactic databases. Professor Klexon was studying my work with the kind of intense focus usually reserved for examining alien artifacts. The tissue alignment is acceptable. The bleeding has ceased. The patients report decreased pain levels and improved mobility. He paused, and I swear I could hear his worldview creaking under the strain. Perhaps there is some merit to these traditional approaches. Look, I said, standing up and dusting off my hands. I'm not saying your fancy equipment is useless. I'm sure it's great for complicated stuff. But sometimes the problem isn't complicated. Sometimes someone just needs a band-aid and 5 minutes of attention from someone who cares more about fixing them than about demonstrating how smart they are. The medical bay had finally gone quiet, except for the gentle hum of life support systems and the occasional electronic whimper from the overloaded equipment. My classmates were all staring at me with expressions that I interpreted as a mixture of confusion, embarrassment, and grudging respect. So let me get this straight, said Vortex, his gaseous form settling into colors that suggested deep thought. You're saying that sometimes the simplest solution is the best solution. Revolutionary concept, right? Who would have thought that if someone has a cut, you clean it and cover it, and if someone's bleeding, you make them stop bleeding. Captain Rexa flexed her arm again and grinned, showing teeth that could probably bite through hull plating. On my world, we have a saying, the best doctor is the one who fixes you, not the one who impresses you. You know what's funny about paradigm shifts? They don't happen gradually. 1 minute you're the class idiot who doesn't understand quantum healing matrices, and the next minute you're surrounded by alien medical students asking if you could possibly teach them how to clean a wound without consulting 17 different databases first. Professor Klexon was the first to crack. He approached me with the kind of careful respect usually reserved for handling unstable explosives or visiting dignitaries from hostile planets. Dr. Morrison, he said, his voice carrying none of its usual condescension. Perhaps you could demonstrate these basic techniques to the class. I looked around at my classmates, who were all staring at me with expressions ranging from curiosity to what I could only describe as academic hunger. Vortex had shifted to colors that suggested intense interest. Krista was resonating at frequencies that sounded almost eager, and the other students were gathering around like I was about to reveal the secrets of the universe. You want me to teach you first aid? I asked, just to make sure I wasn't having some kind of oxygen deprivation hallucination. If you would be so kind. Professor Klexon replied, and I swear his antennae actually drooped a little in what might have been humility. It appears that in our pursuit of advanced medical techniques, we may have overlooked some fundamental principles. So there I was, Dr. Jake Morrison, from Earth, giving an impromptu first aid seminar to some of the most brilliant medical minds in the galaxy. I showed them how to clean wounds without calculating atmospheric pressure differentials. I demonstrated basic bandaging techniques that didn't require quantum-level precision. I explained the revolutionary concept of checking pulse and breathing, before diving into cellular reconstruction protocols. Vortex was particularly fascinated by the idea that you could assess a patient's condition just by looking at them. You mean you don't need to perform a complete biospectral analysis to determine if someone is in pain? Well, I said, if they're screaming and bleeding, that's usually a pretty good indicator. Krista chimed in with harmonics that sounded like genuine amazement. And you can stop bleeding with simple pressure and elevation, without calculating optimal compression ratios. Physics still works the same way throughout the galaxy, I replied. Press on the bleeding, raise it above the heart if possible, and gravity does most of the work for you. Captain Rexa and Engineer Bloom had become my unlikely teaching assistants, demonstrating the effectiveness of basic human medical techniques to an audience of beings who could probably regenerate entire limbs if they thought about it hard enough. The humans' methods are remarkably efficient. Bloom rustled, examining his neatly bandaged cuts. I estimate my healing time will be reduced by 60% compared to standard botanical medical protocols. And the scarring will be minimal, added Captain Rexa, admiring her stitches. On my home world, we would consider this work to be artistically superior to most surgical procedures. By the time we were finished, I had somehow become the most popular professor in the Academy's history. Students were lining up to learn what they now called Morrison protocols, which was just first aid with a fancy name. Professor Klexon had already started restructuring the curriculum to include what he termed foundational practical medicine, and the Academy's administration was apparently considering making basic first aid a mandatory course for all students. Morrison, Professor Klexon said as we were cleaning up the medical bay, I believe I owe you an apology, and perhaps a commendation. Your approach to medicine is refreshingly effective. Thanks, I said, but I didn't invent anything new. This stuff has been around for thousands of years on Earth. Yes, he replied, but sometimes the oldest solutions are the best solutions. We had simply forgotten that medicine is about healing people, not about demonstrating our technological superiority. As I was packing up the basic medical kit that had somehow saved the day, Vortex swirled over to me in colors that I'd learned indicated deep gratitude. Dr. Morrison, could I ask you something? Sure. How did humans become so good at this kind of practical medicine? I thought about it for a moment, then grinned. Well, we're the only species in the galaxy that's dumb enough to climb mountains for fun, jump out of perfectly good aircraft for entertainment, and play sports that involve deliberately crashing into each other at high speeds. When you spend that much time finding creative ways to injure yourselves, you get really good at patching people back up. The laughter that followed was universal, transcending species barriers and filling the medical bay with the kind of warmth that no amount of advanced technology could provide. And that's how I, Jake Morrison, became the first human to revolutionize galactic medicine by teaching aliens how to use Band-Aids. Sometimes the best way to reach for the stars is to remember that you're still standing on solid ground, and sometimes the most advanced technique in the universe is just caring enough to help someone who's hurt. The Academy never did get that fancy equipment working properly again, but somehow nobody seemed to mind.